Hello everyone, I'm Professor Geek. Welcome back to the channel. And welcome to another one of my history versus myth videos. The first one I did was on Jamestown. I'll put the link up there for you to check that out if you missed it. I do like to use footage, my own footage of visiting these places when I'm talking about this. I am an enthusiast of early American history, colonial through revolutionary times, really possibly up to Civil War, but especially that colonial and revolutionary and shortly thereafter. I just I'm fascinated with that. Took a lot of classes in school, but that's not my major or anything, so I'm not like a professor of history by any means. I'm a professor of literature. But I'm fascinated by it, and very much a hobbyist, enthusiast in it, reading it, and liking to go visit it. I've also worked at a few historical sites, and of course you have to study and know a certain bit about that to lead tours and whatnot. And a couple weeks ago it was my birthday, so Sound Engraver and I went to a place I used to work at, a place I hadn't been to in years, over 10 years perhaps. Highland Estate. This is the home of James Monroe, one of my personal favorite founding fathers, kind of considered the last of the founding fathers. He was our 5th president and so much more. I'll talk about him more in a bit. Really fascinating and inspirational guy. But Highland Estate is interesting because it's just around the corner. It's kind of like a little farther up a mountain or into a mountain from Thomas Jefferson's home, Monticello. So that's the big tourist draw, Monticello. People want to go see Thomas Jefferson, the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence and so forth. That he's the big draw. And James Monroe, a lot of people, unless you're a history, enthusiast like myself or hobbyist, you don't really know a lot about him. So he was, one of Jefferson's friends. He built his estate there to be close to his friend for that period of time. What's interesting about this place is that the Highland Estate has gone through a lot of changes recently. In fact, first of all, it's just a glorious place. You go past Monticello and you go up this long drive, and it's so pretty. There are all these ash trees and everything on the property, which is why it was at one point called Ash Lawn. But it's a gorgeous drive up the way. And then there is a historical home on there, and then there's recreated buildings and whatnot. When I worked there, the understanding was the historical building that's there was actually a portion of Monroe's home. Part of it had burned down in a fire, and there was a Victorian addition built on where other owners had come and lived, and different things. But the understanding was that the portion of the historical home that remained was a remainder of James Monroe's home. Well, since I've, left there, and really this is just in somewhat recent years, they've discovered through some archaeological findings that that's not the actual site of James Monroe's home. His home was slightly catty-corner to that, and it had burned down completely. This home that remains is part of a guest house that he had built on the estate. So that is quite a change, quite a change. And it starts to get into this idea of what I'm interested in, which is the history versus the myth. So the guest house is set up as though it were a guest house, impossible setup for being a guest house. And then there are also lots of museum items, lots of recreations, but lots of items that were Monroe's, and you go through and kind of get the story of his all of his years of service. He was a fascinating guy. He did cross the Delaware with George Washington. He was leading a rifle regiment at the Battle of Trent and took on the Hessians in that Christmas night. Wonderful, just amazing story there. Attack on the Hessians, these brutal troopers. Hessians were the Headless Horseman was named after, or was thought to be a Hessian. So these were brutal guys, and Washington's army, the Revolutionary Army, Continental Army, just needs a win. They're about to be decimated, and Washington fearlessly leads them on Christmas night, into this Hessian camp. And Monroe was there leading leading a rifle brigade there. Before that, he was a student at William and Mary, but dropped out just left when the Revolutionary War started because he wanted to join. He was with a group of students who raided the governor's mansion and took all the arms and everything, and then gave them over to the army and joined up. And he was very proud of his military service. He eventually did reach the rank of colonel in a militia, and he liked to be called Colonel Monroe, even more than President Monroe. That was his thing that he was proud of. But he was a diplomat. He negotiated the Louisiana Purchase for Thomas Jefferson, which is a big deal. It's credited to Thomas Jefferson, of course, for doubling the size of the United States at the time, purchasing this land from France. But Monroe was the one who really seized upon that opportunity when he was there. That's not exactly what he was sent for. So, really great diplomat. Of course, he was a wonderful Secretary of War. He really kind of saved us during the War of 1812 under President Madison. And then, of course, became a president himself. And his presidency is known as the era of good feelings because it is so a time of peace, a time where generally people were happy and satisfied. The in terms of the political parties and the political turmoil that had been before that. He did, of course, initiate the Monroe Doctrine. John Quincy Adams, John Adams' son, his Secretary of State, wrote the Monroe Doctrine underneath him, and that was stating that, hey, Europe, you don't have any more say in what goes on over in this new world, this new continent. You don't get to come over here. We're not going to mess with you, but you don't get to come over here and conquer and colonize anymore, whatever, And that's an important, whatever you think of it, that's an important piece of history because it's been quoted by a lot of presidents, even Trump and Obama, quoted it at different times and paid homage to it or referred to it. So he's a fascinating character. The other thing I think about him that's so fascinating is that he's considered the last of the founding fathers because he was there fighting in the Continental Army. After President Washington, he was the first president to have actually fought in the Army. So that was a big deal as a veteran. He also really tried, you think about it, this is 5 presidents in, and each president was serving for 8 years, 2 terms. So this is, a good chunk of years removed from the Revolutionary War in that time. And it was important to him to try to revitalize that revolutionary spirit. That spirit of we want freedom, we want to fight for this, we believe in these ideals. He wanted to re-inspire that into the new generation, the next generation that was going to come and lead into things. Because it was known in his time that the issue of slavery was really, it needed to go away, but no one knew how to really take it away and stuff. And it was already providing some of the cracks in the fabric of the Union at the time. And a lot of things that went on in Monroe's time and even before were eventually the seeds that eventually blossomed into the Civil War. So he could see something like that coming, and he wanted to instill in the next generation at least that spirit, that American spirit of we want freedom, we need to remain true, to have the Union, to fight for all these things. He wanted to instill that and let that at least guide them. So he did a number of things. For one, he was the last founding father to dress like Washington, to dress in sort of I'm missing on the proper names, but sort of the knee breeches with the stockings, the tricorn hat. He would wear that, speaking back to that revolutionary time. Of course, by his presidency, the Revolutionary War, and the French Revolution rather had been taking place, and it was the fashion to wear long pants and so forth. But he still harkened back to that because he wanted to point back to a time in his history that he thought was important, that people shouldn't lose the spirit of. And I can very much relate to that. I think a lot of my fans here on my channel can relate to that. So he's an interesting character. One thing in particular, though, I just want to talk about his home there, which this really plays into the idea of history versus myth. And you can take all of the things I've just said. These are historical points, but you could paint them in a different way, as people do if they want to, say, oh, he's a terrible person because he owned slaves, this and that. Well, all the founding fathers, or most of them, there was a different time and different tensions that they were, it wasn't a matter of just saying, pass this bill, slavery's over. They really needed to do it in a way that wouldn't dissolve the Union. So it's a fascinating issue, a fascinating historical time. But I'm obviously decided to look up to the man for a lot of points. But you can take any set of points, any set of historical facts about a person or a place or whatever, and create stories out of them. And to suit anyone's agenda. One story that was told when I was working at Highland, and this is fascinating. Remember that when I worked there, people actually thought that was his home, that he actually lived there. In the back of the house, you walk out a door into a little garden area, and this door here is through a hallway that shares one chimney with 2 fireplaces on either side. So the rooms on either side of the hallway have a fireplace that butt up against the wall of the hall, and they come up and meet in one chimney over that hallway. So when you walk out that door, you have to bend over to walk out the door. And Monroe was a tall guy. He was taller than me, taller than 6 foot. And, he and Jefferson both were one of the taller, and Washington, one of the taller founder fathers. So if he were in this house, and if he were exiting that door, he would certainly have to open the door and bend over to exit out that door. Well, that's true. It's also true that if you walk out that door, straight over as the crow flies is Monticello. Thomas Jefferson's home, his friend Thomas Jefferson. And we do know that Thomas Jefferson, an archaeological, he was an architect. You know, he liked doing architecture and whatnot, and he helped Monroe plan his estate there and plan his home when it was being built. So one of the tour guides that worked with me, the home interpreters, was a great guy, really, really charismatic. He could tell a story. In fact, he was the one that interpreted Monroe. He would dress as Monroe on different holidays and whatnot, and meet the crowds and talk to them as Monroe. A great guy. And he told this story. He coined this story, which he surely just had to totally make up. But he said that, you know, this, when Monroe would walk out of that door and he'd have to, you know, bend over, he said, now remember that directly that way is Monticello, and that Jefferson helped him design his estate here. So Jefferson thought it would be funny to build a single chimney over that hallway so that tall, over 6 foot James Monroe would have to bow to Jefferson every time he would exit that door, because his estate, Monticello, is right over there, you know. And everybody loves that story. I remember, even when I was working there, I never told the story because they actually told us not to. It's not, they can't historically, you know, verify that story or whatever, especially not now that we know that's just a guest house. That's not even the home Monroe technically lived in. But it's a great story. And I would, every time, even now, over 15 years, 16 is probably since I've worked there, even now, if I tell people I've worked there, if they've toured the area and if they've gone to that house, that's the one thing they tend to remember is that story. If they had one of my coworkers' tours, or if somebody else told that story to them, it's the thing they remember the most, even more than some of the fascinating stuff James Monroe did for us. And yet, we know that historically, it's simply not true. And of course, you know, being a historical site that's there to preserve history, they would tell us, hey, don't tell that story, obviously. No one can tell the story anymore, of course, because it's just proved to be a guest house at the moment. But that's still a great story, and it deserves a place. It doesn't deserve to be thought of as true historical fact, but it's such a great story that you don't just let that die. You don't just let that lie there and okay, forget about that. Never tell that again. That doesn't have any place because that story doesn't work. That's not to be told. No, that's a great story, and it affects people. It charms people. It's a good story. You know, why not tell the story, you know, on a tour? Let them know that it's obviously not true, but this is something, you know, a funny little thing that people would say or whatever. It's just fun. It's a fun story. You don't discard the myth. A lot of things, like the famous portrait of Washington crossing the Delaware. The individual standing behind George Washington holding the flag, that's James Monroe. Now, most historians will tell you that James Monroe didn't actually ride in the same boat as Washington. Washington wanted to cross after the whole army had crossed, so he wouldn't have, Monroe would have gone over much earlier with his rifle brigade and so forth. But who cares? Like, when you show that piece of art is not there to teach you historical fact. It's there to inspire you with a sense of pride or inspiration for that historical moment that was so impressive. And yet, every jerk who knows a little fact will show you that portrait, and the first thing out of their mouth isn't that amazing? Isn't that a wonderful portrait? Wasn't it so cool what happened to Trenton? Doesn't that just inspire you? No. The first thing they say is, oh, of course Monroe didn't cross over there. He wasn't really there. And this was based on the Rhine River. So these ice chunks, you know, weren't really there. And that kind of boat, that's not even technically the kind of boat that Washington would have crossed. Where is your soul, dude? I mean, like, you're just like one of those people that, that loves to correct me and fill in all of this useless information when I talk about anime. It's like, this is the stuff I know! This is the stuff I know! Okay, you know stuff. Good for you. Does it help what we're trying to do here at all? This painting is just to inspire. This painting is a piece of art. It's not a historical document. You know, so things like that, we discard the myth so easily today because, oh, that's not really true. Well, so what? It's a myth. It worked to inspire. Lots about Washington's life may not technically be true or may be looked at through mythological lenses, but that's still vitally important because it shaped and inspired the nation in the way it was built at the time, you know? And Monroe kind of reflecting that, being the last president to reflect back on that Washingtonian times, you know, is important for that. So I could go on, but I've showed enough footage, talked enough. So that's all for now. I'll be back with some more of these places. Check out James Monroe if you haven't. He's a great, fascinating historical character and one of our founding fathers, 5th president. Until next time, keep enjoying and digging deeper into the true hero stories you love.